Hey, I'm Kale, and we are so back. And what are we back with today? We're back with Magical Mystery Tour by the Beatles. Now, Magical Mystery Tour is interesting because technically it doesn't count as a Beatles studio album, but I consider it one. So it's a soundtrack for a movie that was produced by the Beatles in 1967, but only this front half is the actual soundtrack to the movie, and then the B-side is all just a collection of singles that were released in 1967. And in the UK, where the album orders are generally considered to be official, it was just released as an EP, and it only contained the songs that were actually in the movie. But the American version, they released it as a whole album for some reason, and the B-side of the album was singles that were released in 1967, like I just said. And obviously, I got the LP here with the front side and the back side. Before I get into anything else, I want to talk about just the background of this album in general. During the Sgt. Pepper's sessions, probably around April of 1967, when the sessions started to wind down and they were getting into mixing, they had an idea. They had a very vague idea of creating an experimental film with its own soundtrack, sort of like, how they did with Help and Hard Day's Night, except with drugs. And basically right after the Sgt. Pepper sessions, in late April and early May of 1967, they recorded a few demos and a few songs with a very vague idea of what this movie was going to be. Now, what is the movie, you may be asking? Well, it's basically an hour and 15 minutes of nothing. There are characters. There's a really, 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 and I want to stress, really, really loose storyline to the entire movie. But it's basically, to sum it up in just a few words, it's the Beatles and a bunch of other people in a bus for an hour. And that's basically the whole movie. Now, there were recording sessions for the actual soundtrack part of the album were held from in many, many, many different increments from April of 1967 all the way to late September of 1967. Obviously, for the other songs, I'll talk about when they were recorded individually when I get to the track-by-track breakdown about them, because they weren't really recorded in line with the actual soundtrack recording. A very major event that happened during the recording of the soundtrack and filming of the movie was that the Beatles' longtime manager Brian Epstein died in August of 1967. And his death had a massive effect on the Beatles. It's a main contributing factor on why they broke up 3 years later. But despite Epstein's death, the Beatles continued recording the film and the soundtrack throughout the rest of August into late September. But yeah, now on to the track-by-track breakdown. And of course, track number 1 is the title track, Magical Mystery Tour. This was actually the first song recorded for the soundtrack. It was recorded actually during the late stages, the very, very late stages of the Sgt. Pepper recording sessions in late April. The vocals were recorded during the Sgt. Pepper sessions, and then the brass and most of the instrumentation was later added in June or July when they started mixing the earlier tracks. This song had more uses of Beatles tape looping. They gathered a tape loop of just car sounds from the highway and they just dubbed that over the whole song. I can confidently say that it is definitely the best song about a magical bus that was recorded in mid-1967 by 4 British guys. And there are 2 of them. There are 2. So I just want that to be known. Anyway, the next song is Fool on the Hill. Fool on the Hill is actually one of the last songs recorded for the soundtrack. It was recorded in late September 1967. The meaning of the song is pretty ambiguous. It's either about the Dutch art collective The Fool, which the Beatles were working a lot with in 1967, or it's about the Maharishi, which they were, getting really into it at this point in August of 1967. The portion of the film in which Fool on the Hill is basically just Paul McCartney prancing around the mountains in Nice, France. Next up is Flying. Flying is interesting because it's the only released Beatles instrumental track. There's one from 1965 that was close to being released called 12 Bar Original, which was a 12 Bar Blues original instrumental, but they never released that. Yeah, this was basically just a little jam session that was recorded in September of 1967, and it's found its way onto the album. Another thing that's unique about it, it's a rare occurrence of all of the Beatles harmonizing on it. They're just like vocalizations throughout the whole song. John Lennon plays the main part on the mellotron, which was a instrument that he was really getting into in 1967. He was really into the mellotron at that point. Next up is Blue Jay Way. Blue Jay Way is the only George Harrison song on the album. The song is about when he was staying at a house on Blue Jay Way, which is a street in the Hollywood Hills, and he was waiting for his publicist Derek Taylor to show up, but he was taking like a really long time, so he wrote this. The song is structured sort of in a way that Indian classical music is structured, which, you know, George Harrison was all about at this point, where it sort of has like a drone playing throughout the whole song and throughout the different stanzas and stuff, which I'm pretty sure the drone is played on like just a low tone on a mellotron, but I could be wrong. But yeah, Blue Jay Way's actually always been one of my favorites on the album, like since I was a real tiny one. I don't know why, but I'm a fan. But yeah, on to the next one is Your Mother Should Know. Your Mother Should Know is like a ragtime dance hall sort of thing that Paul McCartney wrote, and Paul McCartney wrote a lot of those specifically for like the White Album, which, you know, was the recording sessions for that only happened like a few months after this. And mostly because it was the type of music that he like grew up with. It's also in the style of like When I'm 64, which was on Sgt. Pepper's. So yeah, he's a big ragtime guy. The song was initially proposed to be performed on a live TV broadcast called Our World, but they opted out of playing this and chose a different song, which I will talk about later in this video. Another significant thing about this song is that it was the last newly composed song that Brian Epstein heard from the Beatles before he died. He died a few days after hearing Paul McCartney's demo of Your Mother Should Know in August of 1967. Next up and closing out the A-side is I Am the Walrus. I Am the Walrus is probably the most famous and popular song from the soundtrack portion of this album. And I Am the Walrus is basically a nothing song. It's not actually about anything, it's just words. He got the idea for writing the song when he found out that schools in England were breaking down Beatles lyrics as a part of like a writing and English class, as he thought it would be funny picturing a bunch of 8-year-olds breaking down a song about absolutely nothing. In the portion of the film in which the song is in, they're in an abandoned World War II airfield in England, just a fact. And this song had the most recording time dedicated to it of any song on the soundtrack portion of the album. It basically took up all of September to record and perfect. Composition-wise and orchestrally, it's one of George Martin's masterpieces, like composition-wise from a producer standpoint. And yeah, I forgot to mention the album is produced by George Martin, like every other Beatles album except for Let It Be. I don't really know why I felt the need to clarify that, but yeah. But yeah, that will close out the soundtrack side of the album. Now opens the random singles, and it opens up with Hello Goodbye. Now the thing about Hello Goodbye that's different than all the other singles on the album is that it was technically recorded during the Magical Mystery Tour like recording sessions. It was recorded during the I Am the Walrus sessions, so one could make the argument that technically it was made for the album. Hello Goodbye was released as a double A-side single in November of 1967, and it was backed with I Am the Walrus, which proves once again that this was actually meant to be an album, and Hello Goodbye was one of the lead singles. Just saying. Beatles also recorded two different versions of music videos for Hello Goodbye, and they were both shown on the Ed Sullivan Show in December of 1967. Hello Goodbye was initially written for that Our World TV special that I was talking about, but they also did not go through with that. Next up is Strawberry Fields Forever. Now this song obviously was not in any way intended to be on this album. So the song was recorded in November to December of 1966, right after the Beatles had wrapped up their final Revolver tour, and then that also marked the start of the Sgt. Pepper sessions, which were from then November 1966 to like April of 1967. And then Strawberry Fields was released as another double A-side single in February of 1967 while they were recording Sgt. Pepper's. This one was definitely just thrown on the album because it was in fact a single that had been released in 1967. Like Hello Goodbye and some other on this second side, you can argue like could technically be intended for a full-length Magical Mystery Tour album, but Strawberry Fields and then the next song I'm going to be talking about absolutely could have no intention to be on this album. The song Strawberry Fields Forever is, the title refers to the Salvation Army orphanage that was like right next to John Lennon's childhood home. So the song's basically just about like nostalgia, and also it's like widely recognized as being like one of the best songs of all time, but that's sort of besides. And next up is Penny Lane. Penny Lane was also recorded a full year before this album came out in those really, really early Sgt. Pepper sessions in November and December of 1966, and then a little bit into January of 1967. It was the B-side to Strawberry Fields Forever, which is why it also doesn't really have an argument to be on the album. Like Strawberry Fields Forever, it's just about nostalgia in Liverpool. Penny Lane is a street in Liverpool, and he talks about the street in Liverpool. So yeah, it's basically about nostalgia in Liverpool. Next song is Baby You're a Rich Man. Baby You're a Rich Man was written and recorded like basically right after Sgt. Pepper's was released in May of 1967. John Lennon plays the clavulin throughout the song, which I'm just bringing that up because it sounds kind of weird, and I always wondered what that instrument was throughout the song, and I looked it up like while researching for this video. Also, Mick Jagger provides vocals in the chorus, which I also learned while researching for this, and I never really heard it before, and then I listened to it again after I'd found this out, and it's pretty easy. It's pretty easy to see. Lastly, on the album, closes out with All You Need Is Love. Easily one of, if not the most famous Beatles song just ever. And it's basically just the 1960s counterculture anthem. It was released as a single in July of 1967 with Baby You're a Rich Man as its B-side. And this was the song that was chosen to be played live on that Our World TV special that I've been talking about the whole time. The song opens up with a part of the French national anthem, and basically throughout the song, one of the main themes is that it kind of just has a bunch of different like classical, European classical songs throughout. And yeah, that'll do it for the track-by-track breakdown part of Magical Mystery Tour. Now let's talk about my thoughts. At one point, I'd call Magical Mystery Tour my favorite Beatles album. I don't know if that still stands right now, but it is definitely up there. And I don't care that people technically don't count it under the Beatles album canon, but I do, because it is. And you can make that argument because the only reason that the B-side of the album isn't a compilation is because the singles had never been put on an album before. So you could technically make the argument that all the singles that were released prior were just, in promotion for the album, which isn't true, obviously, but you could think that way if you wanted to make yourself feel better about it being an album. But yeah, it is an album. It is good. I listen to it if you want. I don't really care. Also, sorry for abandoning the channel for 2 months. I was kind of just burnt out and didn't wanna. So uploads should be more frequent than, every 2 months. But yeah, I'm Kale, and that is Michael Jordan, and goodbye, both of them.